Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Responding to Jordan Peterson in Lieu of a Debate conference. I am Dave, or Lisa. I am the president of NSP at Boise State. NSP stands for New Symbolization Project. And we are the critical theory club here on campus. It's my honor to be able to make these opening remarks. I just have a few things to say really quick. First of all, a huge shout out and thank you to everybody who's been volunteering all day. Stand up, please. This has been, for the last 2 days, you've all been like lifesavers. That's you too? Yeah. They all stayed sitting, but it's cool. Oh yeah, well, Athens standing already, yeah. Is Sky back in here yet? There's stragglers still, so getting donation. I've been organizing this thing for the last 6 months, and NSP has been through some officer changes as some people graduated and moved on. Some people put their education on hold for a little bit so they could write books, like Sky out in the hall. And then we've had new officers come in, and you know, it's been a crazy feat, like being able to like pull this whole thing together. All the people helping. I want to make a big shout out to the School of Public Service, the Sociology Department, the Philosophy Department, especially for helping, but ASBSU and student involvement as well. Huge thank you. So what is NSP? What is this hashtag JPCon thing that we're doing here? Who's Jordan Peterson, and why Marxism? And why did we bring a Marxist to campus? New Symbolization Project is, well, like I said, the critical theory club here on campus, but our mission is that we are trying to critique, undermine, and outgrow capitalist, realist, and reactionary political discourses, which pretty much constitutes the sum total of discourses if you, well, not the sum total, but damn near in Idaho especially, but YouTube generally. And I say YouTube just because that is the place that has spawned this phenomenon, Jordan Peterson. So this conference has been going on now for 2 days, and we've had something like 16 participants partake and present in breakout sessions, and it's been fantastic. It's been amazing. We've had a lot of expertise here from all over the country and the world, critiquing Jordan Peterson on a variety of issues that he seems to kind of step outside of his own expertise on. As for capitalist realism and reactionary politics, I think it's really important to always like talk about what are these words we throw around. Capitalist realists essentially just think that the way things are now is the way things will always be, and that it doesn't make any sense to talk about alternatives, and that we just have to get over the fact that we live in a society where our identities and our validity is always coming from the fact that we do or do not contribute to the growth of profit. That your very human dignity and worth is always vis-a-vis capital. That's capitalist realism. The only future is this one. We're at the end of history. Reactionaries say, yeah, this is not good. We've fallen from some state of, from some better place. And they want to go back. And they either fight to go back, or they just kind of like, you know, we'll go along with the way things are, but if people try to change things for the better, no, because the better thing was back there. NSP is not like the DSA, our comrades here, who have also helped put this thing together. The DSA has more of a party line, even though they're not a party. NSP supports them, thinks that they're great, they're doing good things, but NSP is a little more open to saying we don't know if socialism's the answer, or if anarchism's the answer, or if we don't know what the answers are. We're just critical of capitalism. And we, in general, support something called like an egalitarian worldview. But the thing is that a new symbolization or a new symbolic order is not something that's going to come today, and it won't come from the next 3 years of political discourse or cultural discourse that we could have sitting around tables talking about books, which is largely what we do. No, it's going to instead come from a multi-generational struggle towards this thing called justice, whatever that is. And that's something itself that we have to all be arguing about all the time, not just saying, oh, that's stupid. We already did that. That's been done. Just clean your room, go back to work, get with the system, bucko. I kind of say that flippantly, but I don't want to make fun. I think that Jordan Peterson is someone to take seriously. And there have been questions raised today, but especially over the last 6 months. Why? Why do something like this? Why respond to Jordan Peterson? Well, He's the #1 bookseller on Amazon for months. Does that count? Well, maybe not. Not everyone who's #1 bookseller counts, right? We don't respond to everybody, right? I mean, isn't he just a self-help guru? Well, not really, because the more you dig in, the more you see that there is this, sometimes it's right below the surface, sometimes it's clear as day, reactionary or capitalist realist message, right? And that largely, and this is the big thing, his entire message of self-help, which is valid. Get yourself together. Of course. Clean your room. Sure. Yes, Dad. Of course. I know this. I still won't do it. No. Even though that's true, he couches it in this rhetoric of, this is what the left does not want you to know. They don't want to tell you that you have to get your life together because you're a snowflake. So, you know, you're a precious little snowflake. We don't want to offend you, right? We wanted to break past this stereotype where he's saying that we don't want to have like serious, rigorous, critical conversations and say there's a lot of ways of doing something like this, and I think protest is a valid way of responding to some people sometimes. Milo for sure, Peterson maybe. I don't know. There's a spectrum there, and we all have to argue through the gray areas, not just avoid them. But Peterson in particular is, and a few people that have presented in the last couple days have put it this way, quenching a thirst, a deep thirst for meaning, for the humanities, and for the social sciences, for people who do not have access to that. If you do, there's a certain kind of privilege or advantage that you've been given, right? If you've internalized a lot of leftist assumptions or liberal assumptions, congratulations, not everyone has them. Not everyone had access to that. And so not everything that seems ridiculous off the cuff that he says seems so ridiculous to other people. And instead of just making fun of people or dismissing people or saying, well, that guy's an idiot, you need to instead be mature and respond, right, in kind. Because the thing is we did that with Ayn Rand. She didn't go away. She's been the most influential philosopher in the last 300 years, arguably. I mean, Marx was pretty influential too. But I'm just saying in American politics, though, Rand was very influential. And I think that if we spent a little bit more time really breaking it down for people who don't really see what's so obviously wrong there, I think it would just be helpful in general, right? And this is kind of our idea for bridging the academy and the public. All right, so that's enough of the why and the how, and I'm just gonna show 3 video clips and then turn this thing over. So, first I wanted to show a sensible clip.
If you ever want to think about something, that's exactly what you have to do. Right? You want to take arguments that are against your perspective and you want to make them as strong as you possibly can so that you can fortify your arguments against them. You don't want to make them weak because that just makes you weak. And so, you know, Sam and I are both scientists, and it really is the case that what scientists are trying to do, and I think what we're actually trying to do in this conversation genuinely, is to try to find out if there's something that we're thinking that's stupid. You know, because when I'm laying out the arguments that Sam just summarized so well, I've tried to generate a bunch of opposition to them in my own imagination, and the arguments I put forward are ones I can't undermine. But that doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean that at all. And so if someone comes along, this is certainly the case if you're a scientist who's worth his or her salt, if someone comes along and says, hey look, you made a mistake in this fundamental proposition, it's like, yes, great, that means I can make progress towards a more solid theory of being. In his
What I want to point out here is that sometimes when you see a clip of Peterson, he's very reasonable. In fact, I would argue that most of the time that's the case. It's very rarely, in fact, that he loses his temper on Twitter and says something about bitch slapping somebody. This is like, that's the minority of the case. Most of the time, he's pretty much holding it together pretty well, especially considering the fact that there's a lot of people out to like scream in his face, right? And that, in a sense, there's a lot of people who look up to him because he's brave. You know, because he self-censored himself for a long time and refused to talk to leftists because he was convinced that they would castigate him if he said anything. But there's this thing that you do if you have this stereotype of the other that scares you, and then you self-censor yourself, and then you feed that stereotype with, you know, the scary data of the world. Every once in a while when something crazy occurs, you think, oh my gosh, it's true, see how they will be. And then eventually when you've had too much, you come out and you say the damn thing like he did against Bill C-17. Right? C-16. And what he's doing here with Sam Harris is having a debate about the concept of truth, which is fantastic and it's amazing. And I'm really happy to see philosophy in the mainstream, always. I just wish that he would engage with the people that he spends so much time writing off, the scary postmodern feminist neo-Marxists, where he's basically taken everything he doesn't like in the world and put it all together and then said, it's them, right? Well, NSP is the postmodern feminist neo-Marxist here at Boise State. And when we emailed him about him ditching out on this Zero Books debate that he was going to have with Douglas Lane, okay, that might not be fair. We don't know if he ditched out. He canceled. So I'm not going to speculate as to the reasons, all right? So that's neither here nor there. But the point is that they had a debate scheduled in January, and Douglas Lane, who's here, by the way, hey, is a wannabe Marxist. A wannabe Marxist. If you want to hear from the wannabe Marxist, come to an event tomorrow at 10 a.m. But it's really important, though, to point out that, that 2 weeks after this event was canceled, in the midst of Douglas rescheduling this debate, on the Joe Rogan podcast, this happened.
Have you ever debated a Marxist supporter? Have you ever debated someone who is pro-equality of outcome?
No, they don't debate me. Well, the closest thing I think to that was the debate I did at the University of Toronto about the Bill C-16.
He wasn't dating Marxists at that debate, so that's sidestepping the issue. And also, what's this equal outcome thing? That's not Marxist. But that's besides the point. This is 2 weeks after that debate was canceled. So we found that really interesting, and we reached out to Douglas and said, well, so this isn't happening. Do you want to come to Boise State and just give a talk in lieu of the debate? Because we were pretty excited about that debate happening. Doug said, sure. This then just kind of turned into a conference. So I'll speed up this story by just saying that when challenged on Reddit by one of his fans to, well, why did you cancel on this debate and then say that Marxists won't debate you? His response was that Douglas Lane in Zero Books just not popular enough, and he has hundreds of invitations per week. I'm sure it feels that way. He's become very popular very fast. It's probably a lot to manage. We also have to keep in mind that there are like layers of bureaucracy now. He's hired agents essentially to coordinate a lot of the stuff for him. So I'm not going to say that this is all just him. There might be some miscommunication in the process, but that saying that Zero Books is not popular enough is not a response to the actual question. Why did you cancel? Because if you believe in this marketplace of ideas and free speech for the sake of letting the best ideas win, it's not about popularity, especially when you want to steelman your opponents, when your rule number 9 from the 12 rules of life is to assume that the other might know something that you don't, right? Wouldn't you want to talk to that other that you keep fear-mongering? And I'm going to wrap it up with this last clip.
I just wanted to make a quick insertion into this video to say that I never finished where this line of thought was going in these introductory remarks, and that it's very important context. One of the things Peterson fans tend to say is that we're taking things out of context. Well, the context of this conference and of Richard Wolff's presentation is that because Jordan Peterson said that Douglas Lane was not popular enough on Reddit to warrant a debate, we reached out to Richard Wolff, who is one of the most popular Marxists on the planet, and Richard Wolff said he was willing to do the debate at the cost of travel, or he would speak in lieu of a debate. We made sure to get that there because we thought if Peterson will not do the debate, we still want to have Wolff there, because the thing is like everything that Jordan Peterson doesn't seem to understand about Marxism is also stuff that most people don't know about Marxism, and therefore is information that we would love to provide a platform for, especially if that person was Richard Wolff. And so when we reached out to Jordan Peterson's people to say, look, Richard Wolff is willing to do this at cost, the answer was, okay, well, yeah, we would debate him, but not for less than $50,000. They said $75,000 to $50,000 is basically like the range that Peterson asks for when debating, which is like, okay, so on the first count, we had Douglas Lane, who's not popular enough. On the second count, we have Richard Wolff, we were willing to pay for Jordan Peterson's airfare and hotel, just like we did with Richard Wolff, but we couldn't pay any more than that. We're just a student club. We didn't have the funds. So on the first count, Peterson seems to have evaded debate with Douglas Lane and Zero Books. On the second count, he seems to have obstructed debate with Richard Wolff through NSP. So that's all I wanted to say. Now we'll cut to the part where Peterson basically gives his depiction or expresses his understanding of what Marxism is. And we'll go.
And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine.
There were two posters advertising this event. I wonder if you only saw one and then came. The first one was responding to Jordan Peterson in lieu of a debate with Richard Wolff. The other one was what every responsible citizen needs to know about capitalism, because it's the same thing. Please welcome Richard Wolff.
Thank you all for coming, although I came further than you did. I came on the airplane today from New York City, and my head is still bouncing around. The flight from Minneapolis was bizarre. It's strange. Anyway, I have many things I want to share with you. I'll start with a couple of comments on Jordan Peterson, but you've done a lot of work on that. I haven't. He does mostly work in psychology, at least he's a professor of that. That's not my field, and I'm not going to presume that I can roar in there and have lots of interesting things to say that you don't already know better than, and that he probably knows better than too. I am going to comment, though, just for 2 or 3 minutes, on when he makes forays into economics about capitalism and or Marxism, because those are embarrassing. And again, there are many things he says that are astonishing to me. I've spent my entire life in American university. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I've looked really hard to find Marxists at the various universities I've taught at. And there were very, very few, and they were really scared and mostly kept their mouths shut. So when he describes the Marxists all over the place, he and I inhabit a different planet, and I had no idea what he is really talking about in that area. Number two, the tendency to equate Marxism, by the way, he uses mostly in the singular, with what happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin. I really thought we had kind of outgrown that at the end of the Cold War, which ended in 1989, and I don't know where he's been since then. Let me remind you, just for those that don't know, Karl Marx died in 1883, roughly 150 years ago. At the time he died, he was not that well known outside of Europe, a little bit. He lived in London most of his adult life, wrote all his major works, or not almost all his major works there. And after his death, his ideas spread. In the last 150 years, they spread to every country on the face of the earth, to people with radically different cultures, histories, politics, and economics. They all interpreted Marxism in their distinctive ways. There is no Marxism. There are only Marxisms. And if you don't have the time and interest to learn about the different ones, that's fine. But to use it in the singular is bizarre and says more about you than it does about the subject. Now, did the Soviets under Stalin use Marxism and claim to be Marxist? Yes, they did. And do we have to, in some way, take account of that as one of the many strands of interpretation? Absolutely. But to reduce Marxism to that one There's no warrant for that. That would be the equivalent of me chucking Christianity because the Catholics had an inquisition, or that the Christians who came to this country wiped out the ethnic folks they found here. And I could go on, couldn't I? But I won't. I won't, because you all understand, yes, there has to be some account taken of what has been done in the name of Christianity. But as a warrant to throw it out, that's bizarre. That really doesn't make much sense. I find it embarrassing to see that sort of argument made. But I'll leave it at that. I want to talk about what you asked me to talk about, which is about capitalism and the Marxist critique of it. So let's jump into that. First, the critique of capitalism is as old as capitalism. Every economic system had the people who loved it and the people who didn't. That's not unique to capitalism, and it should come as a shock to nobody. Slavery had people who thought it was great and hated it. Feudalism had people who thought it was great and hated it. And capitalism, in case you're not familiar, has had people who thought it was great and who hated it all along. If you're not familiar with that, we all know why, or I hope you do. Because you and I, unless some of you are from other countries, but you and I, in most cases, grew up in a society which for the last 50 years has had a virtual taboo on criticisms of capitalism. And you have to be a little not so insular. That's an American problem. The rest of the world, more than we do, knows about those criticisms. And by the way, Americans did too. Coming out of the Great Depression in the 1930s, there was an enormous interest in criticisms of capitalism. No big surprise, because in the 1930s, for those of you who might not remember, capitalism crashed badly. A reminder, 1929, October. That's why October is such a scary month in the stock market. No, it really is. It's part of why we had the volatility a week or two ago. And we will again. Because October is a jinxed month. It hit in 1929. It wasn't over until 1941. 3 years in, 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States, 25%. That's 6 times what it is now. 25% means 1 out of 4 workers were unemployed, which means every American family had somebody who wasn't working. And because there was no unemployment at that time, no unemployment compensation, that person had to either rely on church or family, or neighbors maybe if you were lucky. A cataclysmic collapse. We here don't understand that because most of us weren't alive then. We only have the second worst collapse of capitalism, the one in 2008, but it's taught us a lot. Anyway, out of the 30s came an enormous explosion of criticisms of capitalism. Not so surprising, given what was happening. So we've had that. We've had lots of good criticism of capitalism here in the United States. We had it at the end of the 19th century. We had it again early in the 20th century. We had it again with the crash in 1930. I like to tell my students, I ask them a guess. Where did critics of capitalism, by the way, who called themselves socialists back then, where did they do best? Which state legislature had the most elected socialists of all the 48 states at the time? I won't quiz you. You probably wouldn't guess in a million years. Oklahoma. Socialism in Oklahoma. Lots of it. I bet you there was a lot here in Idaho, too. So criticism of capitalism is not new. There's been criticism, but the criticism died after World War II, or to be more accurate, was murdered. Because at the end of World War II, 1945, when Roosevelt dies, and we can come back to this, it was a very important period in America. Roosevelt dies, the war is over, and the business community is roaring mad. Because in the Great Depression, we had had a movement from below in this country. the CIO, the biggest wave of unionization the country had ever seen before or since, and a big socialist party, two of them, and a big communist party, and they all worked together. And they put the squeeze on Mr. Roosevelt in Washington, and he had to do things for the mass of people. I can see from your faces that this history is maybe a little rusty. So let's do just 2-3 minutes. In the depths of the Depression, they went, the communists, the socialists, and the unions, because they represented millions of workers then. They went to the president and said, we want a meeting. The president, smart politician, didn't say no. You couldn't say no. It's not America today. It's America then. And they got together and they met. And the unions and the socialists and the communists said to the president, you've got to do something to help the American people through this horrible depression that we're suffering. And the subtext, which nobody needed to spell out, was simple. If you don't, Mr. Roosevelt, you won't be president much longer. Not only will we not vote for you, but these nasty socialists and communists over here are talking about making a revolution. Roosevelt thanked everybody for their opinions and immediately called a meeting with the business community, and, you know, he came from that kind of family anyway. He know these people. And he told them what had just happened with the unions and the communists and the socialists. And then he surprised them. He said, I advise you to let me do what they want me to do, to help the mass of the American people. But not only do I want you to let me do it, you got to give me the money to do it. Because this is the United States government, and the depths of depression with millions of people out of work, there are no taxes coming in. We can't do it. The government can't do what has to be done for those people. But I advise you, rich American businessmen, notice I didn't say businesswomen, we hadn't gone that far yet in America. They were all men. I advise you to give me the money. And here's why I advise it to you. Because if you don't give me the money to do this for the American people, my guess is you won't have any money at all anyway. So give me a bunch so you can keep the rest. Kind of a blunt conversation, don't you think? He split the business community. Half of them hate him. Their descendants are called the Koch brothers. And the other half went along, which is all he needed. He went back to the unions and the communists and he said, I'll make a deal with you. I'm going to take care of the American people like you asked, better than you asked. But that talk about a revolution, that's got to stop. And they said, okay. The unions, the communists, and not all of them, they were dissenters, but they basically said, okay. Good, said Roosevelt, now I'll do it. I can see again from your faces, quickly. Gets on the radio, no TV then, right? Gets on the radio and establishes, in the midst of a depression when there's no money, the Social Security system. We've never had that in America before. He announces, when the government has no money, that I'm going to give a check to everybody who's 65 years of age for the rest of their life. I'm going to do that because it's going to help millions of Americans. And not just the older ones who are 65, but all of the children who would have had to help their parents without a government check. So it's really good for everybody. Wow. Second thing he did, he established unemployment compensation. We never had that before either in America. In the midst of a depression, he announced, I'm going to give every unemployed worker, and there were millions of them then, a check every week for a year or so. Wow. Then he passed the first minimum wage. We never had that before in America. And I left the big one to the last, because your faces are giving you away. He created a federal employment program. Between 1934 and 41, the federal government hired 15 million American unemployed people. He put them to work, gave them a check every week, paid them a salary, which meant they didn't lose their homes because they could make their mortgage payments. And you know what those people did, those unemployed people? They built many of the national parks that you all visit and enjoy. They did the first conservation work in this country, the Civilian Conservation Corps. The WPA said to all unemployed artists, come, we'll hire you. Can you paint? Can you sing? Are you theatrical? Do you know how to sculpt? Can you, whatever, come, we'll make troops and we'll send them all over America to bring culture to the rural and small towns. I've never seen such a thing before. It was the greatest explosion of shared culture in American history. We've never had anything like it before, and we've never had anything like it since. Wow. And guess what? To give every old person a check every month, to give every unemployed person a check every week, and to hire and pay the salaries for 15 million people, where did Roosevelt get the money? Here comes the best part. Ready? He taxed corporations and the rich. I gotta say that again. You know why? Because so many of you imagine that that's not possible. That somehow that's not in the works. That that's pie in the sky, a vague utopia, a distant future. No, it isn't. It's your history. He went and taxed them, big time. Hey, let's go do it now. He took money from corporations and the rich to do wonderful things for the average American citizen. Well, to be honest, the average white American citizen. Blacks, true to our nature as a country, were left out. Do you understand? He took from the rich and gave to the poor. Robin Hood. Now, what happened to the president who dared take from the rich to take care of the American mass of people? He was elected and re-elected 3 times. He was the most popular president in the history of this country. Nobody ever came close. So it turns out it's not bad politics either. You just have to have the situation. Or to be more accurate, you have to have a movement from below that makes it happen. And that's not a pie-in-the-sky dream of the left. That's your history, from which you can draw the conclusion, if it was done before, it can be done again. Which, as you'll see when I finish, is your job. Okay, let's do the critique. And here, by the way, let me be clear to you. The critique of capitalism you're getting now is the product of Marxist theory. Not only Marxist theory. People who are not Marxist have been critical of capitalism. Lots of them. All Marxism is the most developed tradition of that. It's not the only part, but it's the most developed. Everywhere in the world there are Marxist journals and parties and movements and even some governments you might remember, like the one that's the country with the most people, China, which in the name of Marxism runs its society. So there's lots of criticism, but I'm going to draw on the Marxists. Here we go. And it's very condensed, but it's what you asked me to do. And it may help you remember. First, capitalism produces and reproduces inequality, big time. There's a number of ways to say this. My hope is most of you already know this. You can see it in your community or in your family or in the country, but if you can't, here's some help. Capitalism produced, I like to hit on him from time to time, so we'll start with Jeffrey Bezos, the head of Amazon. He currently possesses himself $160 billion. Okay, I'm an economist, so pardon me as I explain to you what that means. If you have that kind of money, what you do is you entrust it to other people to manage it, either because you don't know how or you don't want to spend your time doing it. The kind of persons you give it to are called a hedge fund, or it could be a trust fund of some other kind, or managing bank. And I'm sure he does that. I don't know the details, but all people like that do it. Okay, let's assume they get him 5%. Mostly they do better than that, but let's assume modestly. Okay, let's do the arithmetic. 5% of 160 billion gets him $8 billion a year. And I divided the 8 billion a year by 365, the days in a year. And it comes out to it comes out to a number that explains why he does not buy lottery tickets. He gets $22 million a day, every day, 7 days a week, all year round, whether he works or not. $22 million a day. Now I'm going to leave you with a simple question. The world, you, me, but the rest of the world has a choice. It could take $22 million a day and use it to overcome poverty, to help people cure illnesses we know how to cure, to provide education to the people of the world. Or we could allow it to accumulate so that the richest person on earth can become richer still. If I had time, I would stop now. I'd play the national anthem and ask you just to think about it. But I don't, so I won't. But there's more. A few years ago, an economist like me, French, named Thomas Piketty. I hope some of you know a little bit about his work. He works in Paris, although he works with a colleague at Berkeley, Manuel Saez. And by the way, the two of them, Saez and Piketty, have the best website on this planet for understanding wealth and inequality in the world. Every economist, left wing, right wing, and in the middle, uses it. Anyway, Piketty wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century, and it's 600 pages showing you how, why, in every place where the capitalist system settled, starting in 18th century England, spreading to Europe and the rest of the world, it produced, as a tendency, ever worsening inequality. The only reason it wasn't a straight line is that periodically, here we go now, periodically people reacted against the level of inequality and rose up and stopped it and sometimes reversed it. And it lasted a while until it faded out and the underlying growth of capitalism reproduced the inequality. That's what happened in the 30s. We undid the inequality of the previous 50 years in America because of the things I told you, and it lasted for a while, up in the 50s, 60s, and then it faded out, and now we have the last 40 years, which you're living the results of, when that inequality's all come back again. Capitalism produces inequality, which is a bit embarrassing for the system if you think about it. Capitalism is usually credited with having been brought to us by the French and American revolutions at the end of the 18th century. The slogan of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, brotherhood. Capitalism, which overthrew feudalism in those revolutions, America cut away our being a colony of the feudal George III. So we were told, we, the people of the world, get capitalism, replace feudalism, and you will get liberty, equality, and fraternity. But we didn't. The promise of capitalism to deliver equality was never delivered. We have been betrayed by capitalism. We got the capitalism. We have never gotten the equality. I'll leave you to decide whether you got liberty and brotherhood. Oh my God. The United States Revolution, the American Revolution, added something. That the bringing in capitalism, unleashing the colonial economy from its fealty to the British Empire, would bring us democracy. We would get democracy. And in America, democracy is our religion. We invoke it 10 times an hour, or else we feel something's missing in our lives. So let's talk about democracy and whether capitalism has delivered it or not. Now you see the next step of the criticism. We've talked about inequality, now we're going to do democracy. All right, by democracy, I need to tell you what I mean. It's when a decision affects you, democracy insists you must have a role in making that decision. You know, we get to vote on the mayor of our town because we know the mayor makes decisions that affect us as residents, and so we have some power, at least to vote for the fellow or the woman or not. Like we vote for a senator or president or anything else. So in our neighborhoods, we understand that democracy means if we're affected by a decision, we have power over it. We participate in the decisions that affect our lives. Okay, let's go now. We're going to get up in the morning like most of us do on a weekday, 5 out of the 7 days. We're going to brush our teeth, put pomade in our hair, and go to work. And we're going to cross the threshold into the workplace. The factory, the office, the store, it doesn't matter. And now let's follow what happens there over the best hours of the day, the 8 hours of the day, 5 out of the 7 days of the week. Somebody tells you where to stand, where to sit, what to do, with what equipment, in what way, for how long. And at the end of the day, when you've poured your brains and muscles into producing something, you're told to go home and leave what you produced there. And if you take it with you, people in blue uniforms come to your house and they hurt you. Which you know, which is why you don't take except the occasional stapler. Right? Right? There's no democracy in the workplace in capitalism. There never was. What are you talking? You're being told by what? Typical American works for a corporation. That's what does most of the business. Corporations are run by a group of people called a board of directors. They typically have somewhere between 12 and 20 people on them. They're elected by the shareholders. And since 10% of Americans own 80% of the shares, a tiny number of Americans selects the board of directors. You, as the employee, don't. You don't have any power over the people that will decide what you produce, how you produce, where you produce, and what is done with the fruits of your labor. You're just a drone. And at the end of the day, you're to go home, stuff yourself with pizza and beer, and come back tomorrow and do it all again. Something you've noticed which is making you feel that your job is a burden, not something you look forward to. There's no democracy in the workplace, and there never was. That's not how capitalism is working. Never did. Well, let's see now. Where do adults spend most of their waking life? At work. If you believe in democracy, that's the first place you would have instituted it. But you don't, and you never did, and you don't even question it. The United States is bringing democracy to other countries. You can't bring what you don't have. What are you talking about? This country has made a fetish of democracy in the community, in the residents. But in large part, it's a guilty conscience because it's missing from the work life. And what possible excuse is there? Either you believe in democracy or you don't. And if you think there's a moral principle that people affected by a decision have to be able to participate, well, here's a decision at the workplace. You're fired. Here's another one. Your salary's being cut. Here's another one. You're going to work the 4 a.m. to 9 shift from now on. You know, many of you have gone through this. You're free to go and do it again with another employer. Come on. There's no democracy in the workplace. There never was. Capitalism didn't bring us democracy. Nothing like it. And when you hear some pompous jackass tell you about capitalism and democracy, remember, it's a jackass. I'm trying to be fair here. Okay. Next, stability. A lot of us put some stock in stability. We like to know that we can go home to our house at the end of the day and it'll be there. And maybe our spouse and our children and our friends and we want some stability. We want to know the job is there and we can count on the income and the work and the life. We can, stable. A lot of people like stable. You know, occasionally something wild, but stable. Let's see, how does capitalism do on stability? Badly, or really badly. Now, for those of you who don't know, every place that capitalism has ever gone, ever settled in as a dominant economy, again, from England at the end of the 18th century, all across now to be the dominant system in the world, it has an economic downturn, nice phrase, every 4 to 7 years. Let me do that again. Every 4 to 7 years, this economic system tanks. Now, sometimes it's awful, like the one in 1929 to 41, or the one since 2008. Those have been doozies. But for those of you who don't know, between the end of the 1930s collapse, from 1941 until this new one in 2008, there were 11 other economic downturns. For those of you that are interested, there's a government agency called the National Bureau of Economic Research, which measures all that and keeps the records. Every president since Roosevelt has said, if you just do my policy, the current clown is doing it too, like all the presidents. They promised, if you just do my policy, it will get us out of this bad economic time. Why is each one saying it? Because each one is president at one of those, because we have them every 4 to 7 years. If you follow my policy, not only will we get out of this downturn, but we will not give that kind of problem to our children. Every president has promised it. No president has ever delivered it. At the end of the Great Depression, we were told that we had learned how to manage our economy better. We had reforms, we had regulations, and they would make sure we didn't have this again. Well, in 2008, you could see how deeply they understood their situation. Wishful thinking didn't work out. The largest bank in the United States today is the J.P. Morgan Chase Bank in New York City. Last week they issued their regular reports. I'm one of those kind of people who reads that stuff. And they predicted the next downturn will be early in the year 2020. That's less than a year and a half from now. Welcome to capitalism's instability. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. But you accept it. In fact, many people think it's somehow natural. It's sort of like the rain. You know, how many of us stand there screaming at the sky saying, you know, it's horrible, don't rain on us. We don't do that. We accept it. That's the way it is. And that's what people do with this unstable system. Wow. Now the last one. I could go on all night, but I won't. The last problem with capitalism. It's something Marx called uneven development. And if you've never thought about this, it's a reason to read Marx. Here was his argument. A system could be designed that had the following logic to economic development. You don't concentrate all the development in one place. You spread it out. You try to develop your new industry where people need jobs and there isn't already an industry. You try to evenly develop the world. And here's why you want to do that. If you make some areas real rich and other ones real poor, guess what? This is really complicated. The poor are envious. The poor are jealous. The poor are angry. And the poor, this is for today, move. Guess where they move to? Well, where would you move to? Where the rich people are. Because the jobs are nice and they keep the streets clean. We complain about migration. Hello? The way to deal with migration is not walls and cops. We've tried that for centuries. It doesn't work. If you don't want people to rip themselves out of the cultures and neighborhoods and families that they want to stay with and go thousands of miles somewhere else, you know, like those people in that caravan in Honduras and in Mexico now, to a country that they know doesn't really want them, where they don't speak the language, and God knows what will happen to them. If you don't want that to happen, don't make uneven development. Don't develop one part this way and another one dirt poor. But that's how capitalism always works. It takes, even when it takes a poor area and builds it up, you can be damn sure that not far away there's a good area that's being smashed down. On the edge of New York, Harlem, which used to be a really beaten down poor place, is now a thriving gentrification from poor upscale. But then we have Detroit or Cleveland, or my favorite, if you've never been there, Camden, New Jersey. These are places that once were quite prosperous and are now disaster. For those of you not familiar, Detroit, 1970, population 2 million people. It was the place presidents took visiting dignitaries. What a successful capitalism, the automobile industry, everybody had a job. Even African Americans coming from the South got jobs in the auto plants. It was success. 1970, fast forward to today. Population of Detroit today, 680,000 people. Do you understand? The majority of the people of that city were driven out because there's no work, there are no jobs. A third of the housing stock in Detroit today sits there, empty, burned. They recently had a problem because the city has no money since the houses are gone, the taxpayers are gone, so it laid off all the dog wardens. Meanwhile, all these people leaving Detroit with no money said goodbye to the pooch, got in the car and left the dog. Okay, the dog and no wardens. Dogs, because I'm very polite, I will not discuss what dogs do, but they do something and that makes more dogs. And these more dogs have no warden. So Detroit, 3 years ago, had a serious problem, ready, in America, of wild dogs attacking people. That's capitalism. Gentrification in Harlem, smash Detroit. Inequality, no democracy, uneven development, and instability. You want to tell me why you're in favor of this kind of system? What are you doing? Why would you do that? What possesses you? Some of you know of a website called YouGov. They did a poll not too long ago. And they asked Americans 18 to 29, do you feel favorable to capitalism? And then they asked the same question, do you feel favorable to socialism? On the question of favorable to capitalism, they had a result, 2015, 39% said they were. By 2018, this year, it had fallen to 30%. Based on what we know about the Bernie Sanders campaign and others, the percentage of Americans who are favorable to socialism is probably higher. That's the country you live in. It's not what you read in USA Today, but it's the country you live in. I didn't make any of this up. I wouldn't dare. So what's going on? Now this is the hardest part, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm not an alarmist, I'm really not. I think capitalism has had an enormous run, has enormous powers of revitalizing itself, even when it stumbles as badly as it usually does. And so I'm going to tell you, I mean, you don't know me personally, but take my word for it. I now think it's over. And I've never thought that before. I think we're done. And I think you better think about that, because I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think so. The level of problems we have now as an economy is nothing like I've ever seen before. I happened, which is, by the way, why, oh, a footnote for those of you. Yes, I'm a Marxist. No horns, see? But I am one. And I'm happy being one. I've learned a lot from that tradition. And you would too if you have not yet looked at it. It's got a lot to teach you. And you know why? It's really simple, and you really do know all this. Let me tell you a story that shows it to you. Suppose you lived on a street, and at the end of the street there was a house, and there was a family in it. You knew that, a mother and a father and two kids. And for some reason, you wanted to get to know the family a little bit. You're going to write a report. So you decided, I'm going to go talk to the people in the family. And you had heard a rumor that one of the kids thinks it's the greatest family, feels lucky to have been born into it, and the other kid thinks that their family is a psychological basket case. Okay, suppose you knew all that. So you took your notebook in hand, you went to the end of the street, you knocked on the door. Would you ask to speak to only one kid? Either one. I hope and I assume that the answer is no. You'd understand that if you want to understand the family, you talk to each child, each kid, you ask whatever questions you think are pertinent, and you draw the best conclusion you can based on the research you've done. But you wouldn't in advance not talk to the critic, or for that matter, the celebrant. But you live in a society, I can tell you that as a professor of economics, in which 99% of economics departments in the United States do not contain a professor who's a critic of capitalism. We are too frightened as a country, and we have been for half a century, to do that, which doesn't reflect well on us. If our capitalism is half as strong as it pretends to be, it should have nothing to fear from people who are critics. I tell you even further, if you don't allow a critic, you don't fix your problems. You don't recognize your flaws. You allow the worst things to be indulged in you. Come on. What's this childish fear of the critic and the criticism? The critics find things you're doing you could do better. That's why you have criticism, because it helps. Sure, some people can be blunt and unfriendly and mean and nasty. We know that. And you try to work around them or find a critic who isn't got a psychological problem like that. A critic who actually likes the thing, wants it to be better. Marxism has always been a point of view for me, why I'm attracted to it, because it has a simple idea. We can do better than capitalism. Why the hell do we stay with it? Why do we constantly keep fixing what isn't adequate? You know, it's like that person when your refrigerator punks out one more time, and you call that man or woman, and they come, and they got all the uniform and the tools, and they putter around there, and then they get up and they have that look on their face. You kind of know what they're going to say. And here's what they tell you. Sure, I can fix it. It'll be $200. But I'm telling you, 4 weeks from now, you'll be on the phone and you'll call me back. It's over. You got to get a new fridge. Because you're throwing money, after money, and in the end, it's not good for you. And I'm here to tell you, even though I can make money fixing it, you're better off. I'm in that position. A personal note. One of the reasons a Marxian economist like me can get jobs. I taught at Yale, I taught at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst most of my adult life. I teach now at something called the New School University, which is a major institution in downtown New York City, is because I went to the right schools. This is America. And after all that conversation about democracy, if you go to the right schools, things happen to you that do not happen to you if you do not. So let me tell you about this one. I went to Harvard as an undergraduate. When I graduated, I went to Stanford. I got my master's degree. Then I left there and I went to Yale, where I got 2 more master's degree and my PhD. You get the picture? I'm a poster boy for American elite education. At Yale, in my class, when I was getting my PhD, one of my classmates was a young lady named Janet Yellen. She became the head of the Federal Reserve. Get the picture? We all know each other. It's a small group. I get together with them, since I live in Manhattan, a few blocks from Wall Street. And when we get together, and I was mentioning this out to someone in the hall, we have a very peculiar conversation. We don't agree because they're right-wingers and center and lefties like me, and we don't agree on how the America got into the situation it's in, and we do not agree on how to get out of it. I'm going to tell you how we can get out of it, but we don't agree on that. But here's what we all agree to, and we're all shocked. We look at each other across coffee or a drink, and we say, this is the worst condition of the American economy in our lifetimes. We all agree. You've got to think about this, not because of some ideological commitment. It's your life that's going to be shaped by all of this. The level of debt taken on by corporations is unprecedented in America. Because of the collapse in 2008, as I hope most of you know, the Federal Reserve brought the interest rates down to near zero, and for some periods of time, actually below zero. Below zero means that the government pays banks to borrow from the government. You borrow $1,000 and you give back less than that at the end of the year. That's how desperate they were to keep the economy going. But if you make borrowed money cheap like that, every capitalist who dreams that this latest project will work, that this latest investment will work, even when it's not looking good, borrows free money to try to make it work. That's what they did. They borrowed loads of money. And now for projects that aren't working out, so they can pay it back. This should sound familiar to you. It's called the subprime industrial loan. Uh-oh. Yeah. And you know what's making it worse? Capitalists are always nervous. In the nature of capitalism, you got to invest now, hire workers, build a factory, but you won't see the output for a year or 2 or 3, which means you've got to commit money now for something that's uncertain, the future. Nobody knows what the future is going to be. Uncertainty is a very dangerous thing in capitalism. Why? Because all of us depend on what a tiny minority decide to do. Will they invest or won't they? By the way, another footnote about democracy. 200 corporations make a decision not to invest. We all have a recession. We don't have anything to say about it. They make the decision. We live with the results. What is our power over that decision? Zilch. Again, if I had time, the national anthem. But I won't, because we don't have the time. So uncertainty breeds hesitance to invest. Terrible. You know what's causing a lot of uncertainty now? Mr. Trump's trade wars. We have no idea. What are the Chinese going to do? What are they already going to do? What are the other countries going to do? What are the Europeans going to do? What are the Canadians and Mexicans going to do? Everybody's going to retaliate. The idea we're all going to lie down and do what the United States wants. Only Fox News reasons like that. The world does not work like that. Doesn't have to and will not. That uncertainty is making the already difficult problem worse. This is a capitalism that has also taken a remarkable step that ought to offend all of you. I don't know how many of you know. Germany, the most successful capitalist story since the great crash of 2008. Germany, last year, made all tuition at all colleges in the country free, zero. Not just for German citizens, for everybody. You can go to Germany, there'll be no tuition. The United States, in contrast, is loading up a generation of young people with a level of debt that they know they can never pay. That's crazy. We are not a crazy people, but we're acting crazy, and that's a clue. Every economist I know, left-wing or right-winger, says the future of the American economy depends on the quality and the quantity of the young people going to college. That's our trained labor force. Overwhelmingly, in case you're not familiar with it, 3/4 of our college graduates come out of public school, not private school, public school. We are savaging our public school. Every state in the union is cutting the money, and you're all loading up on debt. So you can't dare take a course you might love to because you know your debts. You got to get a job quick and get some money and start paying it down. What kind of life is this? Is this necessary? No. There are 8 countries in Europe doing what Germany is doing. What's the matter with this country? Why do you permit it? Why do you permit this? It's loading you up with a debt for the rest of your life and promises to punish you if you don't pay on time. You couldn't do this in Europe. The streets would not be yours anymore if you did. What's going on? Smart people, the American people, cutting their own educational programs left and right. My students, my PhD students, they can't get jobs as professors. They're all adjuncts. Adjunct is a cheap word in which you get a person to work very hard for very little money, which is why it's being done. But they can't read books, they can't research. They're running around from one school to another, making do with crappy salaries to substitute for what they used to hire in the way of professors. What? You're damaging the quality of the education. You're loading young people up with debts that create anxiety that interferes with their education. You don't need a PhD to understand this is bad for our future. Why would we do that? Because the system is busted. I'm offering you a criticism of a system, but you don't need me. You are living the disintegration of this system. What in the world holds you back from exploring criticism? You need it. This country has to catch up on 50 years, and that's how I'm going to end. I want to tell you what's happened to Marxism and its critique of capitalism over the last 50 years. It's clear you don't know. How could you? Who would have taught you? You would have had to do it all on your own. It would have been doable, but you'd have to strain, you'd have to go ask people to help you, you'd have to find the literature. One of the reasons I suspect, I don't know of course, I suspect that Jordan Peterson, when he talks about this, has to talk about Stalin, which is now 75 years ago, is because he probably hasn't kept up with all that has happened. But Marxism doesn't stand still any more than anything else does. So here's how the Marxist critique of capitalism went over its 150, 200 years, just to catch you up and maybe tantalize you a bit. Marx writes that capitalism is a betrayal. That's where I got the idea. Marx loved the slogans of the French and the American Revolution, said so over and over again. He loved liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy. But he came about 50 years after the French and American revolutions, 50 years after the founders of modern economics, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and he said, look, I'm here 50 years later, so capitalism has settled in. They were celebrating it when it was just coming, but I'm here after it's had a good 50 years. And it's really settling in, and it's defeating feudalism left and right. But liberty, equality, democracy, and fraternity, we don't got that. We've been betrayed. And that became Marx's project. He set himself the task, I'm not going to document that it's been betrayed. You don't need me for that. He says that. You want to see that capitalism hasn't brought us liberty, equality, fraternity? Here's a quick way. Read Dickens. Remember? Dickens describes mid-19th century capitalism. It's a horror show. Very rich people on the edges of London, and then Mr. Micawber. Remember some of the characters? Or Émile Zola in France, or Maxim Gorky, or Jack London here in the United States. You get a feeling for what capitalism was. So Marx wasn't, I'm not going to document it. The novelist, he often said that, do a much better job than we scientists ever do. He said the trick is, why? What happened? Why? He took it for as granted that the goal of the revolutionaries, American and French, was sincere. They wanted capitalism to bring liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. They believed in those things. They thought it would work that way. So Marx said it didn't, so the question is, why not? That's his project. Did something happen that blocked capitalism from doing this? What was it? What could we do about it? Those were the questions. And again, long story short, he figured it out. That's his contribution. Here's what he figured out. Nothing external to capitalism prevented it from delivering liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. It's capitalism itself that is the problem. Built into it are the mechanisms that preclude liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. So that if you want those things, here comes the punchline, you got to get rid of capitalism. Come on, you already know this. Somewhere you all know it. Every 20 years in the United States, we have a war on poverty. You know why? Because we lose them every time. Poverty doesn't go away. Every 20 years, some great person, Michael Harrington in 1960, and whoever the next ones are. We can't solve our racial problem. We can't solve our poverty. We can't solve our inequality. The system itself. And Marx answers the question, well, what is it about the system? And now I'm going to give you a very short, basic lesson. Bear with me. I think you'll see it's worthwhile. Here's Marx's analysis. Whenever a human being in a capitalist system goes and looks for a job, something I'm assuming all of you or most of you have had to do, and you sit down with your prospective employer, and you discuss what you're going to be asked to do and what time you have to show up and all that. And then you get to that dicey moment when how much am I going to get paid? And let's just say for the sake of an argument, you're going to get paid $20 an hour. That's what you agree to. Here's something Marx then points out, which you know, but you don't want to face. There are a lot of things we all know that we don't want to face. I hope you already know that. It'll save you a lot of grief if you're aware and expect to discover it about yourself. Here we go. The employer will never pay you $20 an hour unless the following sentence is true. During each hour that you work for that employer, for which he pays you 20 bucks, you have to add more than 20 bucks worth of stuff to whatever that employer makes and sells. Because if that weren't the case, there'd be no profit in it for him. Now let me drive home what Marx means here. For those of you who've looked in the mirror on a good day and said to yourself, I'll never work for anybody who doesn't pay me what I'm worth, you don't understand the system. You're never going to get that, and you never did. That's not how this system works. You've got to face that. You get paid enough to reproduce yourself as an employee, while the employer grabs into his hands all of those extras, those profits that your labor, that extra you produce over and above what he pays you, that's what he gets. That's his profit. That's why he's in business. He gets richer. You don't. The rest is fairy tales. And they're not nice fairies. Marx is explaining something. And it rings true once you start thinking about it. Here's how it rings true. And we'll end with this. Think about slavery. We all can think about it. We know it, especially in this country, because we had a period of time with slavery. In slavery, the slave does all the work. And whatever the slave produces is entirely taken and owned by the master. But the master gives back to the slave some, because otherwise the slave wouldn't survive till tomorrow when he wants it all done tomorrow again. So if you think about it, the slave produces, the master gives back to the slave a portion of what the slave produces, but he keeps for himself the other part, what Marx called the surplus, what the slave produces over and above what he gets back. Now let's go to feudalism, lord and serf. For those of you who don't know, the serf worked 3 days of the week on the land that the lord gave him, and he kept whatever he produced there. And the other 3 days of the week, he worked on the land of the Lord, who kept whatever he produced there. And on the seventh day, as you all know, he went to church to learn why this is a good way to live. Very important, the church. The 3 days at the end of the week, well, those are surplus. That's when the serf produces more than he gets. The capitalists thought they were overcoming slavery by getting rid of the ownership of one person by another. And they thought they were getting rid of feudalism by abolishing serfdom. What they didn't understand, the sad news I got to give you, is that we didn't get rid of the dichotomy of a small number of people, masters, controlling the slaves to get the surplus, or a small number of lords controlling the serfs to get the surplus. We didn't get rid of it. We just changed the form. We have employers who pull the surplus out of employees. That's why we didn't get the liberty, fraternity, equality, and democracy. The change we made wasn't enough, was it? And it lasted for a while. So did slavery and feudalism. Good 300 years, not a bad run. It's done. It can't. The contradictions are mounting. Solving one problem produces immediately another one, and you don't know how to go. And the mass of people are disgusted with the old leaders because they're no good at it, rightly. So they try a new one. You can see where that's going to go. Everywhere that's happening, not just the United States. The British working class, which suffered more after 2008 than ours did. They voted, they imagined in their wild thinking that if they cut themselves off from Europe, it will solve their problem. That's crazy. England will now become what it once was, a cold, wet, offshore island of Europe. That's not going to solve the problems of the British working class. They just struck out to do something because they were so angry. The Italians just voted in a crazy government. What are they doing? They're just angry. They're angry. And the Americans were angry too, and they voted for Mr. Trump because he was different. He shoots his mouth off. He's this, he's that. Whatever you think. He's different. He made a point of being more different than any of those others that he was up there with. If you had to choose between another Bush or another Clinton, you go for Mr. Trump, because at least he's not that. What he is, that's another matter. But he's a symptom, like Brexit, like the Italian government, and so on. Let me end by imploring you to think about all of this in terms of a solution. And I'm going to offer you one as a conclusion. Imagine the logic of what I've been saying to you coming to this idea. If democracy was something we did as a human race, at a certain point we said to the kings and the queens and the czars and the emperors, no more. We're either getting rid of you, figuratively, literally sometimes, or we'll let you be as a figurehead, the British solution, where the most important thing about you is your outfit, that sort of thing, We got rid of them. The kings and queens were not nice about it. They threatened. There has to be a leader. There has to be someone in charge. There has to be someone who intercedes with God, if you were in the religious frame of mind. But there has to be someone, the buck has to stop someone. You couldn't possibly have a society that didn't have a king. You got rid of the kings, guess what? All the chaos that they threatened didn't happen. Then there was that other story. You can see that I've done this before, so bear with me. The other story went like this. When young people get into their early adulthood, they start thinking about spouses. And this is a very important decision, who you're going to live with, have children with, and all that. This is an extremely important decision, so obviously the choice of spouse has to be made by a person's parents. But that was the rule. There's parts of the world where it's the rule now. Still is. It was thought, the idea that you would let a 17 or 18 or 19 or 20, whatever year young person do this when their hormones are out of control, when their understanding of what life is about is too underdeveloped, that's correct. Civilization would fall apart if we ever allowed these young, crazy kids to think they are going to decide who they're going to live with. Well, most of you, if your parents called you this evening and informed you who they were thinking of to pair you up with, would start to laugh. And then you'd give a lecture to your parents, which I don't even want to think about the kind of words you'd use. It's out of the question, and guess what? The world hasn't fallen apart. Well, now let me do Marx for you. Suppose in every enterprise, every factory, every office, every store, it was reorganized. It was made, think of it, a democratic institution. Everybody in the store, everybody in the factory, one person, one vote. We decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product we all help to produce. We do it democratically. Wow! Every one of the problems of capitalism, the uneven development, the inequality, it's all about the minority who controls taking care of themselves, and the result we see. Now there aren't those people anymore. We've changed the structure. There is no king. You don't need him in a factory any more than you needed him in the neighborhood, do you? And why would you ever assume otherwise? Let's play with it a minute as my conclusion. Play with it. Suppose the question was to close the factory in Cincinnati and move to China. The capitalist board of directors says, wow, we can pay the Chinese way less than we pay Americans. True enough. And we'll make a lot more profit by moving to Shanghai, which, by the way, thousands of companies did. But now suppose the workers democratically voted. You think they'd vote the disappearance of their jobs? Would never happen. You want to solve the problem of runaway shops? I just did. Let me give you another example. How do you decide the wages people get? Suppose you had a democratic decision. You think you'd give one guy, I don't know, say Jeffrey Bezos, billions, and everybody else can't pay for their kid to go to college? Never happened. Not in a democratic decision. You might pay some people more or less, depending on the work they did or the education they had. But you're not going to do what we do in this country, would you? Here's another example. A new technology that fouls the air. If you're a rich corporate executive, you live far away in a gated community and you have machines in your basement that clean your air. You don't care. Of course you'll use it because it's more profitable. Now the workers instead, they have to live there. So does their husband and their wife and their children and their neighbor. They're going to do it. You want to deal with the environmental problems? Here's a way. And now here comes the best one. The profit at the end of the year. How does that get decided? I'll tell you by telling you about a Christmas story. You've all been there at the end of the year. It's Christmas party time. And everybody who works at this workplace gathers. And there's the boss, shaky legs, drunk too much, said the wrong thing, particularly to the women. You know, the usual. We all take that for granted. Under the mistletoe. Plastic mistletoe. Because this is a cheap company. And he makes a speech. So I want to thank you, slurring his speech, I won't do that. Thanking you all for the work you did this year that helped to make this a successful year. And then you all go home, and he and the board of directors decides what to do. He just congratulated you for helping to produce. Now, in a democratic way, it's a democratic decision what is done with what we've all helped to produce. Yeah, such an enterprise might make mistakes, but we all own the mistake, and we'll fix it together. Last thing, I promise, the very last. I don't want you to think of this solution, which is what I think it is. The end of capitalism, no more employer-employee. The dichotomy, master-slave, lord-serf, employer, it's gone. We have now finally democratized the enterprise, and that's how we're going to bring equality, fraternity, liberty, and all the rest. But I don't want you to think of it as a solution, pie in the sky, utopian, not at all. This already exists all over the place. And if you don't know that, that's about your education. The most successful example is something called the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. Mondragon started 60 years ago, 1956 to be exact. A Catholic priest in this little town in the north of Spain says to his parishioners, if we wait for people to come here and give us a job, we'll all die of old age. So the only way for us to have jobs, it's a very poor part of Spain was then, is if we become our own employer. So the Catholic priest, by the name of Arizmendi, Father Arizmendi, set up a co-op with the 6 workers. Fast forward to today. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation is a unified corporation, but it's actually 250 roughly co-ops, worker co-ops. They all work this way. Everything is decided democratically. All of these, it's the 7th largest corporation in Spain. It has 100,000 employees. They run it like a co-op, and they've been doing it for decades. They're so successful they have their own university, the Mondragon University, where they teach courses, how to start a co-op, how to run a co-op, how to work out the problems of a co-op. You can go there and you get a degree in it. You didn't know that, did you? Your faces give you away. I wish I could film you and just show you. Just show you. Here's a couple things they did. Once a year, there's a meeting of the workers where they assess the supervisors. And then the workers vote. If the workers like the supervisor, they keep their job. And if they don't, they're gone. The supervisors don't hire the workers. It's the other way around. Try to imagine this. Some of you are grinning with the sheer pleasure of the thing. And right, you should. Here's another decision they made. The highest paid worker at Mondragon cannot get more than 8 times the lowest. That's their range. For those of you not aware, in the United States, CEOs of large companies are roughly 300 times the lowest worker paid. You want to deal with inequality? They've already done that. They've crunched the inequality to much, much less. Nobody messes with Mondragon, not the right wing, not the left wing. Doesn't matter who's in government in Madrid. They're too powerful. People love them, and no one dares. Here's another example. Any of you that know about Italy? Anyone here from Italy, maybe? Okay, there's a region of Italy called Emilia-Romagna. It's one of the regions of Italy. In that part of Italy, 40% of the businesses are worker co-ops. It's the most cooperatized sector. You want to see how, and it's been that way for decades. So don't think that worker co-ops are some impossible pie in the sky. How would it ever work? It's fine. Don't mistake your not knowing it for it not being there. It would be a big, big mistake. Jeremy Corbyn, a name you should pay attention to, is the head of the Labour Party in Britain. Current polls indicate that he will be the next Prime Minister of Britain if they hold an election. Okay? The Labor Party there is like the Democratic Party here, but more leftist. Okay? His party has the following program they've committed to. If the Labor Party is elected, they will immediately pass the following law. Every business in England can continue the way it is, except if that business decides to close down, or if that business decides to sell itself to another business, or if that business decides to leave the United Kingdom and go somewhere else, or if that business decides to become a public business, to issue shares and become a company on the stock market. Any one of those 4 decisions, which are basic decisions businesses make, the law will require them to give what's called the right of first refusal to their own workers to buy the enterprise from the owners and convert it into a worker co-op. And when the skeptics, led by the business community of Britain, scoffed and said, where in the world would the workers get the money to buy the enterprise? Mr. Corbyn smiled and said, the government will lend it to them. You want to create a worker co-op sector in your economy? That's how you do it. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think it could never be done. They're doing it. The British are doing it. And you know why? Because they want their people, what a thought, to have a democratic vote on what kind of economy they want. You want it to stay capitalism, hierarchical, few people make the decision? You want that? Or do you want a democratic workplace? But they know that the only way that people can make a decision is they have to see what it's like to have a democratic. They have to see them all over the place. They have to be able to work in them. They have to be able to talk to people who work in them. And so they're going to build a sector so that their people can then have a democratic decision about what to do. We're not doing anything in this country. They're planning for what the collapse of capitalism might bring as a problem. They're already working on it. We live in a country that pretends there's nothing to think or work about at all. If you have found even a small part of what I just did in this last hour interesting, you don't owe it to me. I'm just presenting to you what Marxism can teach you. Thank you very much.